The boy was born into gold but grew up in silence. His father's empire stretched across continents, yet his own legs had never carried him beyond the marble hallways of their mansion. At 10 years old, Ethan Whitmore sat in a wheelchair that gleamed like another piece of his father's wealth, polished every morning by servants who never looked him in the eyes. He was fragile, yet his gaze carried a sharpness that came from too much solitude. The world saw a billionaire's heir, destined for headlines and power. But inside the vast house that smelled of old leather and expensive whiskey, Ethan was invisible, overshadowed by his father's endless meetings and the hollow echo of money. His mother had died giving birth to him, a fact whispered but never directly told. In every silence at the dinner table, in every cold nod from his father, he felt the weight of blame that was never spoken aloud. But the silence cracked the day Marcus arrived. Marcus was different from the other staff, not just because he was black in a mansion where whiteness and wealth seemed carved into the walls, but because he moved with an ease that resisted invisibility. He was 25, tall, with hands calloused from years of work, and eyes that had seen too much of a world that never gave him fairness. He had been hired as a housekeeper, a role the billionaire father considered beneath notice. To Ethan, however, Marcus was not a servant. He was the first person who didn't talk to him like porcelain, but like a boy who wanted to laugh, to argue, to live. Their friendship began with music. Ethan discovered that Marcus could play the piano, not like the stiff, flawless instructors his father hired, but like someone who spoke through the keys. Each note Marcus played seemed to bend with sorrow and rise with defiance. Ethan, who spent most of his days in textbooks or staring out the window at the gardens he couldn't walk in, found himself drawn to those melodies. He begged Marcus to teach him, and for the first time in years, his father's mansion echoed with something other than footsteps and business calls. It echoed with music that carried both pain and joy. Still, shadows lingered. Marcus carried secrets he did not speak. His life outside the mansion was heavy with the memory of prejudice slurs hurled in the streets, jobs refused, neighbors who treated him like danger in human form. Inside the mansion, he endured quiet looks, the subtle tightening of jaws whenever the other servants saw him near the boy. He knew his place in the house was fragile, balanced on the whims of a powerful man who might discard him at any mistake. And yet Marcus stayed because of Ethan. In the boy's eyes, he saw something rare, a hunger for truth, an openness untouched by the poison of wealth and prejudice. Ethan asked him questions no one else dared to. Why did people stare at Marcus when they walked outside together? Why did the newspapers never show people like him unless it was crime? Why did love have to be hidden when it was real? Marcus never lied. He told Ethan the truth, that people feared what they did not understand, that they hated what made them confront their own flaws, that love between two men could cost jobs, families, even lives. Ethan listened, and though he was only 10, he understood something his father never would, that the world outside their gates was broken. The turning point came one evening when Ethan asked a question that made Marcus's chest tighten. "Do you love someone?" Marcus hesitated. In that pause hung years of silence, years of hiding. And then, against every instinct of survival, he nodded. "Yes," he whispered, his voice shaking not from shame but from the courage it took to say it aloud. "I love a man. His name is Daniel. He makes me feel like I'm not invisible." Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't recoil. His eyes, wide and earnest, lit up with something Marcus hadn't seen in so long: acceptance. "That's beautiful," Ethan said simply. The boy leaned forward, as if holding a secret that needed to be protected. "Will you tell him? Will you sing to him?" Marcus laughed, but it was broken by the sting of tears. No one had ever told him his love was beautiful. No one had ever told him it deserved to be sung. That night, Marcus sat at the piano and played a melody he had written but never shared. It was not flawless. The notes trembled, stumbled, rose again. He scribbled the music on a sheet of paper, raw and imperfect. When he handed it to Ethan, he felt as if he were giving away a piece of his heart. "This is for you," Marcus said. "It's a song about healing. Play it when you feel alone." Ethan clutched the paper like treasure. But they weren't alone. The billionaire father had walked in, silent as stone. He stood in the doorway, his face a mask that hid the storm behind his eyes. He had heard enough to know his servant was confessing love that defied everything he considered normal, enough to see his son holding a sheet of music like it was salvation. For a moment no one spoke. The silence was heavy, crushing, louder than any shout. Then the father's voice cut through, cold as steel. "What is going on here?" Ethan's heart hammered, but he did not look away. "He was playing for me. He gave me music." The father's gaze shifted to Marcus, and in that look was every prejudice, every hierarchy of power that had built his empire. "You are here to serve, not to spread your personal choices in front of my son." Marcus straightened. His hands trembled, but his voice did not. "With respect, sir, what I shared is not a choice. It is who I am. And your son deserves more than silence." It was the first time anyone had spoken back to the billionaire. And for the first time, Ethan saw his father falter not in business, not in wealth, but in the face of raw, undeniable truth. The boy, who had never dared raise his voice at the man who controlled everything, spoke then. His words were simple, but they cut sharper than any insult. "Father, I'd rather learn from Marcus than from you." The air cracked. The father's silence was no longer control, it was shock. The mansion had always been a kingdom of power, but in that moment, it belonged to a boy in a wheelchair holding a piece of music, and to a black servant who dared to love openly. And for the first time in years, Hope did not feel like a stranger in the house. The father left the room without another word, but his footsteps struck the floor like thunder. Ethan and Marcus sat frozen, both aware that the silence ahead might be more dangerous than an outburst. Ethan clutched the sheet of music tighter, his knuckles pale. He turned to Marcus, his young face etched with both fear and defiance. "He can't take this from me," Ethan whispered as if swearing an oath. Marcus placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "He can't take what's inside you," he said, though his own chest was heavy with dread. He knew what men like Richard Whitmore did to those who defied them. The following days were filled with an unnatural stillness. The billionaire father avoided his son more than usual, immersing himself in meetings, phone calls, and business trips that seemed endless. But Ethan noticed the change. The butlers who once smiled politely now kept their distance. The head maid avoided Marcus entirely. The air in the house had shifted, growing sharp, as if the walls themselves disapproved of what had been spoken. Marcus expected dismissal. He packed his small suitcase every night, ready for the moment he'd be told to leave. But no word came. Instead, the father's punishment was silence that isolated Ethan even more, cutting him off from companionship in an effort to remind him that Marcus's presence was not permanent. It was cruel, subtle, and effective. Ethan began to feel it pressing on him like the weight of his useless legs. Yet the boy was not willing to surrender. One evening, while the sky outside bled red with sunset, Ethan wheeled himself into his father's study. He had never dared to intrude before. The room was lined with shelves of law books and financial reports, the scent of cigars lingering in the air. Richard Whitmore looked up, surprised, but his expression quickly hardened. "What is it, Ethan?" he asked, as if speaking to a nuisance rather than a son. Ethan's voice trembled, but he steadied it. "Why do you hate Marcus?" The father leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "I don't hate him. I simply know what's proper. A servant's job is to serve, not to confuse my son with talk of unacceptable things." Unacceptable. Ethan's small fists tightened on his wheelchair armrests. Love is unacceptable? Telling the truth is unacceptable. Richard's jaw clenched. "You're too young to understand." "No." Ethan shot back, his eyes blazing. "I understand more than you think. You're the one who doesn't understand. You don't even see me. You don't hear me. You never have." The words struck harder than he intended. For a brief second, Richard's mask slipped, revealing something almost like pain, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "You're a child," he said coldly. And children don't dictate what is right or wrong. Ethan's throat burned with unshed tears. Then I'll grow up without you, he whispered, before turning his wheelchair and leaving the study. When Ethan returned to Marcus's quarters, he was shaking. Marcus listened silently as Ethan recounted the exchange, his heart torn between admiration for the boy's courage and fear for the consequences. Marcus knew men like Richard rarely forgave rebellion. Yet he also knew that Ethan's words carried a truth that could not be erased. Days turned into weeks. Marcus continued to play music for Ethan in secret, softly, late at night when the mansion slept. They spoke in whispers, their bond growing stronger in the shadows. Ethan began to write lyrics for the melodies Marcus composed, words of hope, of longing, of freedom. He hid them in a small notebook under his pillow, as if protecting a treasure from a thief. But secrets never stay hidden. One morning, Ethan woke to find his notebook missing. Panic gripped him. He wheeled frantically around his room, searching every corner, until the door opened and his father stepped inside, holding the notebook in his hand. "I found this," Richard said flatly. "Care to explain?" Ethan's breath caught. "It's mine." Richard flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing at the lyrics. A world where love is not a crime. A home where truth is not punished. He closed the book with a snap. "This is Marcus's influence, filling your head with nonsense." "It's not nonsense," Ethan cried. "It's the only thing that makes me feel alive." Richard's eyes burned with something between fury and fear. "He's gone," he declared. "By tomorrow, he will no longer be under this roof." Ethan's scream tore through the house, raw and desperate. "No, you can't. He's the only one who cares." But Richard turned and left, carrying the notebook with him. That night, Ethan lay awake, tears soaking his pillow. His chest ached with the thought of losing Marcus. At midnight, the door creaked open and Marcus slipped inside. His suitcase was packed, his eyes heavy with sorrow. "I'm leaving," Marcus whispered. "Your father has made it clear. If I resist, he'll make life unbearable not just for me, but for others I love." Ethan's voice cracked. "Then take me with you." Marcus knelt beside the wheelchair, placing his forehead against Ethan's small hand. "You know I can't, but you're stronger than you think. Keep the music alive. It's yours now." From his coat pocket, Marcus pulled a folded sheet, the original composition he had given Ethan. "Don't ever let him take this from you." The boy clutched the paper, sobbing. "I'll never forgive him." Marcus looked into Ethan's tear-filled eyes. "Don't waste your heart on hate. Promise me that. Promise me you'll choose love, no matter how hard it is." Ethan could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. When morning came, Marcus was gone. The mansion felt emptier than ever. Ethan refused meals, refused lessons, refused to even look at his father. Richard, for all his pride, was unsettled by the silence of his son. He had expected resistance, but not this absolute withdrawal. The boy's eyes, once alive with fire, now looked like shattered glass. Weeks later, Richard attended a charity gala, dragging Ethan along for appearances. The ballroom sparkled with chandeliers and glittering gowns, but Ethan sat in his wheelchair like a ghost, unmoved by the spectacle. Richard mingled with politicians and businessmen, boasting of his empire, while Ethan stared at the floor. Then, across the room, Ethan heard something, a faint melody. Piano being played. His head snapped up, heart pounding. The notes were familiar. It was Marcus's song. He wheeled himself through the crowd, ignoring the whispers, until he reached the grand piano. And there, sitting at the keys, was Marcus. Ethan gasped. "Marcus!" Marcus looked up, startled, but a smile broke through. "Ethan!" The boy's father stormed over, his face red with rage. "What the hell are you doing here?" Before Marcus could answer, Ethan shouted, his voice carrying through the entire ballroom. "He belongs here. More than you do." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. The billionaire's perfect facade cracked under the weight of his son's defiance. Ethan wheeled himself to the piano, lifted the folded sheet of music Marcus had given him, and placed it on the stand. "Play it," he said. Marcus hesitated, then laid his hands on the keys. The melody filled the room, tender, fierce, unstoppable. Ethan began to sing the lyrics he had written, his small voice trembling but clear. The ballroom fell silent. Every guest, every politician, every businessman turned to watch a 10-year-old boy in a wheelchair sing a song about love, about truth, about healing. And beside him, a black servant who had dared to love openly played with all the courage he had left. Richard Whitmore stood frozen. For the first time in his life, he had no words. He saw not weakness in his son, not shame in Marcus, but something he could not name, something that cracked the armor of his pride. When the song ended, the room erupted in applause, but Ethan didn't hear it. He looked only at his father, daring him to speak. Richard's lips parted, but no sound came. His empire had always been built on control, on bending the world to his will. But in that moment he was powerless. The boy had won. The applause echoed long after the last note faded, but Ethan felt none of its warmth. His chest heaved from singing, his throat raw, yet his eyes never left his father. He wanted to see anything that proved Richard Whitmore was still human. But all he saw was a face carved from stone, lips pressed tight, eyes dark with rage and humiliation. The crowd was still clapping when Richard stepped forward, grabbed Ethan's wheelchair by the handles, and pushed him out of the ballroom without a word. The applause turned to whispers. Some pitied the boy. Others admired the courage of a child who had defied his father in front of the world. Marcus stood at the piano, heart pounding, knowing this was far from over. In the limousine ride home, silence smothered the air. Ethan clutched the sheet of music against his chest, refusing to let go. His father's knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrest. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice low but shaking with fury. "You embarrassed me tonight. Do you even understand what you've done?" Ethan stared out the window at the blur of city lights. "I told the truth. If the truth embarrasses you, that's not my fault." Richard slammed his fist against the seat. "You are my son. You carry my name. And you will not disgrace me again." Ethan turned his head, his small voice steady. "I'd rather be a disgrace than a liar." The words sliced through the limousine like a blade. Richard leaned back, stunned into silence, while Ethan clutched the music tighter, as if holding on to Marcus himself. Back at the mansion, the boy refused to eat. He refused lessons, refused to see anyone but Marcus. But Marcus had vanished after the gala. Ethan begged the servants for answers, but they shook their heads. Some pitied him, some looked away in fear, but none spoke. His father had made sure of it. Nights grew longer, heavier. Ethan would sit at the piano alone, pressing the keys softly, trying to play the melody Marcus had taught him. His small hands fumbled, but he refused to stop. Sometimes he cried while playing. Sometimes he laughed, remembering Marcus's encouragement. The music became both wound and medicine, keeping him alive in a house that felt more like a cage. One evening, while Ethan played, the door to the music room opened. Richard entered, his face unreadable. He stood silently, listening to the broken melody. Ethan refused to acknowledge him. After a long pause, Richard said, "Why do you care so much for him? He's a servant. Replaceable." Ethan's hands froze on the keys. He turned slowly, his eyes blazing with more fire than his frail body should have been able to contain. "Because he saw me, because he loved without fear, because he gave me something you never did." Richard's jaw tightened. "Love is weakness. Love makes you vulnerable. That's why I built everything I have without it." Ethan's voice cracked, but he spoke anyway. "Then you built an empire on emptiness." The words struck Richard harder than he let on. For the first time in years, he remembered his wife's face, the softness in her smile, the warmth in her touch. He remembered the day she died, and the way he had buried his grief under work and power, blaming Ethan for the life he had lost. He had never said it aloud, but in his heart he knew. He resented his son for surviving when she had not. But now, faced with Ethan's defiance, Richard felt the cracks in the wall he had built around himself. Days later, a scandal broke in the newspapers. Photographs from the gala showed Ethan singing with Marcus, his wheelchair framed by Marcus's tall figure at the piano. Headlines screamed of the Whitmore heir defending a black servant and praising his forbidden love. Some papers applauded the courage of a child. Others dripped with disdain, mocking Richard for losing control of his household. The empire Richard had spent his life building trembled. Business partners called, investors questioned, and for the first time Richard Whitmore found himself cornered. His own son had become the face of a story that threatened his legacy. Ethan read the newspapers secretly, hiding them under his bed. Each article filled him with both fear and pride. People were talking. People were noticing. The truth was no longer silent. But Marcus was still gone, and without him, the victory felt hollow. One night, Ethan overheard two servants whispering in the kitchen. Marcus was living on the other side of the city, working odd jobs after being blacklisted by agencies that feared crossing Richard Whitmore. He was struggling but surviving. That knowledge lit a fire in Ethan. The next morning, he wheeled himself into his father's study without knocking. Richard looked up from his desk, irritated. "What now?" "I want to see Marcus," Ethan said firmly. "No. Then I'll find him myself." Richard leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You think you can threaten me? You can't even walk." Ethan's cheeks flushed, tears burning in his eyes. But his voice held steady. "Then I'll crawl if I have to. I will not stop." The father froze. For the first time, he saw not a weak boy in a chair but a force he could not control. He opened his mouth to argue but found no words. That night, Richard drank alone in his study. The image of his son's determined face haunted him. For decades, he had prided himself on bending men to his will, crushing opposition, conquering markets. Yet he could not conquer his own child. In his haze, he remembered Marcus's words. "It is not a choice. It is who I am. And your son deserves more than silence." The truth gnawed at him. He hated it, but he could not erase it. Days later, Richard ordered his driver to take him across the city. He did not tell Ethan. He did not tell anyone. The car pulled into a shabby neighborhood where the paint peeled from walls and children played in cracked streets. Richard stepped out, an alien in his tailored suit, drawing suspicious stares. He found Marcus working at a small repair shop, grease on his hands, sweat on his brow. Marcus looked up, shocked, as Richard approached. "I didn't expect you," Marcus said cautiously. Richard studied him, struggling with the words lodged in his throat. Finally, he spoke. "My son won't stop asking for you." Marcus's chest tightened. "And what do you want?" Richard hesitated. "I want peace for him. He's wasting away without you." Marcus wiped his hands on a rag, his eyes narrowing. "Peace isn't given by silence. He needs truth. He needs love. Can you give him that?" The billionaire said nothing. His silence was answer enough. Marcus sighed. "Then let me." Richard left without replying, but his mind churned. That night, Ethan noticed something different in his father's eyes, not softness, but a flicker of uncertainty, as if the walls were finally cracking. A week later, the mansion gates opened, and Marcus walked through. Ethan's gasp echoed through the halls. He wheeled himself forward, tears streaming, crashing into Marcus's arms. "You came back," Ethan sobbed. Marcus held him tightly. "I promised I wouldn't leave you in silence." From the staircase above, Richard watched. His heart warred with itself. Pride demanded he send Marcus away again. But something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years, whispered otherwise. For the first time, Richard did not move. The mansion filled with music again. Ethan and Marcus played together, their laughter returning, their bond unbroken. The servants whispered, the newspapers speculated, but Ethan didn't care. For once, he felt whole. Richard remained a shadow on the edges, watching, listening, wrestling with his own demons. He could not yet bring himself to join them, but every night, As the melody drifted through the halls, he felt a strange ache in his chest, a longing he could not name. Ethan saw it. He believed it was the beginning of change. And though his father remained silent, Ethan held on to hope, as tightly as he held onto Marcus's music. The battle was not over, but the war for truth had begun. Autumn came, and with it the first chill in the air. The mansion, always a cold palace, now felt alive again with sound. Ethan played the piano daily with Marcus, their music flowing through halls that had long been empty. It was as though the house itself had begun to breathe. But not everyone welcomed it. The board of Richard Whitmore's company whispered about weakness, about scandal. Investors questioned his judgment. Tabloids printed every photograph of Marcus walking into the mansion, every glimpse of Ethan smiling at his side. Richard tried to weather the storm with the force of will that had built his empire, but every headline reminded him of the truth. His power was slipping. One evening, the pressure broke. He called Marcus into the study, the same study where he had once told his son children could not dictate what was right or wrong. Richard stood at the window, whiskey in hand, his voice low. "You've brought shame to this house," he said without turning around. Marcus's chest tightened, but his voice was steady. "I've brought your son life." Richard spun, his face hard. "He is my son. Mine, not yours to mold." Marcus didn't flinch. "Then why did you leave him starving for love? Why did you bury yourself in money and let him rot in silence? If being his father means possession, you've failed. But if it means love, you have a second chance." The words landed like a blow. Richard raised his glass, then slammed it down on the desk, shards scattering. His shoulders heaved, but no words came. Marcus stood still, refusing to break eye contact, until finally Richard turned away, unable to face the truth. That night, Ethan sensed the storm in the house. He heard the crash from the study, the muffled footsteps, the silence heavier than usual. He wheeled himself to Marcus's room. "What happened?" he asked softly. Marcus sat on the bed, eyes weary. "Your father is fighting himself. He doesn't know how to love. But I think part of him wants to try." Ethan frowned. "Then I'll make him." In the days that followed, Ethan hatched a plan. His health was fragile, but his spirit was burning. He decided to hold a small recital in the mansion. Just family, just a few people, but it would be impossible for his father to ignore. He convinced the staff to help, slipping invitations to people who had stood by Marcus in the past, friends, neighbors, even Daniel, the man Marcus loved but had been too afraid to fight for openly. When the evening arrived, the music room was filled with soft candlelight. Guests took their seats, unsure of what to expect. Marcus sat at the piano, his hands trembling. Ethan wheeled himself forward, sheet music on his lap. Richard stood in the corner, arms crossed, face unreadable. Ethan cleared his throat. His small voice filled the room. "Tonight isn't about scandal. It isn't about wealth or power. It's about truth. It's about music. And it's about love, the kind that heals, not hides." Marcus began to play. The melody rose, tender at first, then fierce, a storm breaking into sunlight. Ethan sang, his young voice carrying the words he had written months ago, words that spoke of freedom, of standing tall even when seated, of loving without fear. Halfway through, Marcus's hands faltered because Daniel had walked in. Their eyes met across the room, and in that gaze was everything Marcus had longed for and feared. Ethan, seeing the hesitation, reached out and touched Marcus's arm. "Don't stop," he whispered. "This is your truth too." Marcus closed his eyes, let out a shuddering breath, and continued. His playing grew stronger, surer. Tears glistened in Daniel's eyes as he stepped closer, as if drawn by the sound. By the final note, the two men stood face to face, years of silence collapsing between them. The room was still. Then Daniel spoke, his voice breaking. "I never stopped loving you." Marcus's chest heaved. "And I never stopped hiding it. But I'm done hiding." Gasps rippled through the guests. Richard stiffened in the corner, every muscle in his body taut. Ethan turned his wheelchair toward his father. His voice, though small, carried the weight of a gavel. Do you see now? This is not weakness. This is strength. This is love. Richard's hands shook. His empire, his pride, his years of silence, all of it pressed down on him. He wanted to deny it, to crush it under his authority. But then he looked at his son. A boy who could not walk, yet stood taller than him in truth. A boy who had inherited not his wealth, but his late wife's unyielding spirit. Something broke inside Richard, or perhaps something healed. Slowly, painfully, he walked to the piano. His voice cracked as he spoke. I don't understand. I don't know how, but I want to try. The words were clumsy, halting, yet they were more precious than any jewel. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. Marcus's chest loosened. The guests watched in stunned silence as the most powerful man in the room lowered his armor for the first time. Richard reached out, his hand trembling, and touched his son's shoulder. Forgive me, he whispered. For all the years I was blind. Ethan's small hand covered his father's. Only if you promise never to be blind again. Richard nodded, his face wet with tears he had not shed in decades. That night, the mansion was filled with more than music. It was filled with laughter, with tears, with truth finally spoken aloud. Marcus and Daniel held hands without fear, their love no longer hidden. Ethan played the piano with Marcus, his father watching with something close to awe. The scandal did not vanish. The newspapers continued to write, some with praise, others with venom. But something had shifted. Richard Whitmore no longer cared. For the first time, his empire was not built on power alone, but on something stronger, in a son who had taught him courage, on a servant who had taught him truth, on music that had taught him to feel again. Months later, Ethan wheeled himself onto a small stage at a community center. Not a ballroom of the elite, but a humble hall filled with families, neighbors, and children. Marcus sat at the piano, Daniel by his side. Richard was in the front row, no longer hiding in shadows but present, vulnerable, changed. Ethan's voice rang out as he sang the same song of healing, of love, of defiance. And this time, the whole room joined in, clapping, cheering, singing with him. For once, the boy in the wheelchair was not the fragile heir of a billionaire. He was a beacon. When the final note faded, the applause was thunderous. Ethan looked at his father, who stood clapping with tears streaming freely, unashamed. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Ethan saw not a stranger, not a cold shadow, but a father. The journey was not over. Prejudice still existed. Challenges remained. But in that moment, in that room filled with music, there was hope. And hope, Ethan knew, was enough to begin again. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.